For most of my childhood, I lived inside a house that looked complete from the outside. Yet I moved through it as if I were unseen. I was present at every meal, every celebration, every ordinary day. But my presence rarely altered the rhythm of the room. Conversations flowed around me. Decisions were made without my input. And affection seemed to travel in directions that never quite reached where I stood. I learned early that being physically there did not guarantee being emotionally included. And that realization shaped how I understood family, love, and my own place in the world. In my home, attention had a pattern. It followed certain voices, certain achievements, certain expectations. I watched as praise was offered generously to others, while my efforts were acknowledged briefly. If at all, it was never harsh or openly cruel. No one shouted that I did not matter. Instead, it was quieter than that. It was the pause after I spoke, the way topics changed before my thoughts were finished. The polite smiles that signaled the conversation was already moving on. Over time, I stopped expecting to be asked questions because the answers never seemed to interest anyone. I became skilled at reading the room. I learned when to speak and when silence would be safer. I learned that sharing excitement about my own goals felt unnecessary when no one leaned in to listen. I learned to smile at the right moments and to lower my expectations before disappointment could fully settle in. Love in my family felt conditional, not in obvious rules, but in subtle hierarchies. Approval was earned through comparison, and I always seemed to fall just outside the frame of what was celebrated. Meals were often the clearest example. Sitting at the table, I listened as achievements were discussed in detail, plans were praised, and futures were imagined out loud for others. When it was my turn, my life was summarized quickly, as if it required less explanation or held less importance. Sometimes my part was skipped entirely. No one meant harm, yet the message repeated itself so often that it became impossible to ignore. I was learning where I ranked without anyone ever saying it directly. As the years passed, those moments collected inside me. They shaped the way I saw myself and the way I moved through the world. I stopped reaching for attention and started shrinking my needs to fit the space I was given. I believed that if I stayed quiet, stayed agreeable, stayed easy to overlook, then at least I would not cause discomfort. That belief did not come from one incident, but from many small ones that slowly rewrote my sense of belonging. There was a night when I sat alone, looking at family photographs that told a story I barely recognized myself in. I realized then that I did not feel missed even when I was present. And that understanding was more painful than any argument could have been. It was a calm realization, almost gentle, yet it carried weight. I understood that invisibility can exist even in the middle of familiarity, and that loneliness does not always come from being alone. Growing up invisible taught me how to observe, how to endure, and how to build an inner world when the outer one offers little space. It also taught me what absence feels like even when surrounded by people who share your name. Those years shaped my resilience, but they also taught me that love without acknowledgement leaves quiet scars. Being unseen did not break me, but it changed me, and the echo of that invisibility followed me long after I learned how to stand on my own. The decision to walk away did not arrive in a dramatic moment filled with raised voices or final words. It formed slowly, built from years of realizing that staying meant constantly shrinking myself to fit into a space that never truly welcomed me. There was no single argument that pushed me out, no final confrontation that demanded resolution. Instead, the choice grew quietly, rooted in the understanding that nothing would change simply because I continued to hope it might. Walking away became less about anger and more about survival. For a long time, I believed endurance was a form of loyalty. I stayed because I thought patience would eventually be rewarded. That consistency would soften the distance and make room for me. I convinced myself that leaving would be selfish, that choosing my own peace would somehow confirm the idea that I was the problem. But the longer I remained, the clearer it became that waiting for recognition was slowly draining me. I was present in a life that asked for my presence but never fully accepted my truth. The realization did not hurt the way I expected it to. It arrived with clarity rather than pain. I understood that I had been asking permission to exist in places where my existence was already minimized. The effort it took to remain invisible was greater than the courage it would take to leave. That understanding shifted something inside me. I stopped asking what I owed others and began asking what I owed myself. Leaving did not mean slamming doors or announcing my departure. It meant quietly loosening my grip on expectations that had never been met. I stopped explaining myself because explanations had never led to understanding. I stopped waiting for the right moment because there was never going to be one. Instead, I chose a calm exit, one that did not require approval or validation. I packed my life into manageable pieces and stepped away without ceremony, trusting that silence could be kinder than confrontation. Starting over felt unfamiliar and unsteady. I entered a world where no one knew my history or the role I had been assigned. There was no reputation to maintain, no comparison to live up to, no past behavior shaping how I was treated. That anonymity was frightening at first, but it was also freeing. For the first time, I could define myself without needing to correct someone else's assumptions. Every decision felt heavier because it was mine alone. Yet that weight came with a sense of ownership I had never experienced. There were moments when doubt crept in quietly, especially during long nights when exhaustion blurred confidence. I questioned whether I had made a mistake, whether familiarity would have been easier than uncertainty. But each time I imagined returning, I felt the same tightness I had worked so hard to escape. The discomfort of starting over was temporary, while the cost of staying would have been permanent. As time passed, I began to notice subtle changes within myself. I stood taller in conversations. I spoke without rehearsing. I allowed myself to want things without apologizing for them. These shifts did not happen all at once, but they accumulated, reinforcing the truth that walking away had not diminished me. It had revealed parts of me that had been buried under adaptation and restraint. The quiet decision to start over was not about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let it define my future. I did not leave because I was weak or ungrateful. I left because I needed room to grow, to breathe, and to become someone who was not shaped by neglect or silence. Walking away was the first honest choice I made for myself. And in that honesty, I found the beginning of a life that finally felt like my own. Building success without their name was never a declaration or an act meant to be noticed. It began as a necessity, shaped by the understanding that carrying familiar associations would only pull me back into expectations that were never mine to fulfill. I wanted to exist in a space where no one measured me against a past I did not choose, where my work could stand on its own without explanation. Silence became both protection and freedom, allowing me to move without announcing each step or asking for permission. In the beginning, nothing about my efforts looked impressive. The work was slow, repetitive, and often invisible to anyone else. I took roles that paid little but taught me how systems function from the inside. I observed how decisions were made, how money moved, and how power shifted quietly behind closed doors. I learned that real progress rarely arrives with applause. It comes through consistency, discipline, and the willingness to keep going long after motivation fades. There were moments when using their name could have opened doors more easily. I was aware of the shortcuts available to me, aware of the advantages I could have claimed if I had chosen to lean on familiar connections. But relying on that would have tied my progress to approval I no longer wanted. I needed to know that what I built belonged fully to me, not to legacy or obligation. So I chose the longer path, even when it felt isolating and uncertain. Working in silence forced me to confront my limits honestly. Every mistake was mine to correct. Every failure demanded accountability instead of excuses. There was no one to impress, no one to blame, and no one to rescue me when things went wrong. That responsibility was heavy at times, but it sharpened my judgment and strengthened my resolve. I stopped chasing recognition and focused instead on building something stable, something that could withstand scrutiny without defense. As time passed, small efforts began to compound. Skills deepened. Confidence grew quietly. I learned how to negotiate without aggression, how to listen without ego, and how to walk away from opportunities that did not align with my values. Each choice reinforced the foundation I was building. Even when progress felt slow, success did not arrive as a single moment, but as a gradual shift in how I moved through the world and how the world began to respond. Reaching financial stability did not feel like victory in the way I once imagined. There was no urge to announce it or share it widely. Instead, it brought a sense of calm that surprised me. Stability meant safety, autonomy, and the ability to choose without fear. It meant that my future was no longer tied to the approval of people who had never truly seen me. That quiet security mattered more than recognition ever could. What made this success meaningful was not the numbers attached to it, but the process that led there. I built something honest by staying patient, by refusing shortcuts, and by honoring my own boundaries. I learned that silence can be powerful when it is chosen, and that independence feels different when it is earned without assistance or validation. Each achievement carried weight because it was grounded in effort rather than inheritance. In building success without their name, I reclaimed ownership of my identity. I proved to myself that I could stand alone, not out of defiance, but out of self-respect. The silence surrounding my journey was not emptiness. It was space, and within that space, I built a life that belonged fully to me, shaped by intention, resilience, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly how far you have come on your own. The birthday dinner was meant to be ordinary, a familiar gathering shaped by routine smiles and predictable conversations. I arrived without expectations, carrying the quiet distance I had learned to wear comfortably over the years. The room felt the same as it always had, filled with voices that flowed easily around certain people while barely pausing for others. I took my seat prepared for polite questions, brief exchanges, and the invisible role I knew well. Nothing about the evening suggested it would become the moment where everything changed. As the dinner unfolded, attention settled where it always did. Stories were told with confidence, achievements were described in detail, and approval moved freely across the table. I listened, nodding at the right moments, content to remain in the background. When someone asked about my life, the question felt formal rather than curious, and the response passed without follow-up. It was a familiar rhythm, one that required no effort from me anymore. I had learned how to exist quietly in spaces where my presence rarely shifted the atmosphere. Then the balance of the room changed without warning. A guest, someone connected through business rather than family, paused mid-conversation and looked at me with sudden recognition. He studied my face as if aligning memory with reality, then stepped closer and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. His words cut through the noise of the room, naming a truth that had never been spoken aloud in that space. He acknowledged my role, my position, and the investment I had made, without realizing the weight those words would carry. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Every conversation stopped at once. Faces turned toward me with expressions that ranged from confusion to disbelief. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself needed time to adjust. I did not move or speak. I simply met the moment as it stood, allowing the truth to remain uncovered. For the first time, attention rested on me without being invited or redirected. The shift was immediate. People who had barely noticed me moments before began to look differently, as if reevaluating assumptions they had never questioned. A few guests leaned closer, curiosity replacing indifference. Others avoided eye contact, uncertain how to respond. The hierarchy that had governed the evening quietly fractured, revealing how fragile it had always been. The reaction from my family carried its own weight. Control slipped in ways that could not be hidden. Expressions tightened, voices faltered, and confidence dissolved into unease. What had been a comfortable narrative no longer held. The truth did not arrive with drama or accusation. It simply existed, undeniable and exposed. And that was enough to disrupt everything. I remained still throughout it all. I did not confirm or deny anything. I did not offer explanations or soften the moment. Silence felt more honest than words ever could have. The truth had surfaced on its own, and guiding it would have diminished its power. The room slowly resumed conversation, but the tone had changed. Laughter sounded forced. Compliments felt hollow. The ease that once defined the gathering never returned. When the evening ended, there was no closure, no resolution, and no attempt to restore what had been lost. I left without a scene, carrying with me the certainty that something irreversible had occurred. The birthday dinner had exposed more than financial success or hidden accomplishments. It revealed how deeply perception shapes value and how quickly respect shifts when narratives collapse. That night marked the end of invisibility, not because I demanded recognition, but because truth no longer allowed me to be overlooked. The dinner did not create conflict through confrontation. It did so through exposure. And once the truth was seen, it could not be unseen. Control had always been quiet in my family, woven into routines, expectations, and unspoken rules that dictated who spoke, who decided, and who mattered most. It did not rely on force or confrontation. It lived in familiarity, in the confidence that things would continue as they always had. For years, that control felt unmovable, reinforced by habit and the belief that certain roles could never change. But the moment truth entered the room, control began to fracture, and what replaced it was fear. The shift did not announce itself loudly. It appeared in hesitation, in the way voices softened and conversations lost their certainty. People who once spoke freely began choosing their words carefully, aware that the balance they relied on no longer held. Control thrives on predictability, and when predictability disappears, it leaves behind uncertainty. That uncertainty is where fear takes root, growing quietly while outward composure tries to remain intact. Those who had once guided every outcome struggled to adjust. Authority that depended on being unquestioned suddenly faced resistance, not through rebellion, but through indifference. When control is no longer respected, it becomes fragile. It demands reassurance, validation, and loyalty that cannot be forced. The absence of immediate obedience revealed how shallow that authority had always been. Fear showed itself in subtle ways. Decisions were delayed. Confidence faded. Familiar confidence gave way to defensiveness, as if any question threatened to expose weakness. What once felt like leadership began to resemble desperation. The need to maintain an image replaced genuine direction, and the pressure to appear stable grew heavier with each passing moment. At the same time, power began shifting without announcement. It did not come through confrontation or retaliation. It moved through attention, opportunity, and choice. People started listening differently, aligning themselves with clarity instead of tradition. Power does not belong permanently to those who assume it will never be challenged. It moves toward those who understand how to hold it without fear. The most striking change was how quickly fear replaced confidence once control slipped. Where there had been certainty, there was now anxiety. Where there had been authority, there was now pleading disguised as expectation. Attempts to regain control felt rushed and unsteady, driven by the realization that influence had quietly moved elsewhere. I did not participate in the struggle for dominance. I did not raise my voice or assert myself. I simply continued forward, grounded in choices I had already made. That steadiness mattered. When control depends on reaction, calm becomes a threat. My silence was not submission. It was proof that I no longer operated within their reach. As fear grew, relationships shifted, alliances weakened. Loyalty, once assumed, became conditional. People who had benefited from control began reassessing where they stood. Power, after all, is sustained by belief. When belief erodes, so does the structure built upon it. The realization that influence was no longer guaranteed unsettled those who had never prepared for that possibility. The shift in power did not bring satisfaction or triumph. It brought clarity. I understood that true power does not need to dominate. It does not demand recognition or compliance. It exists in autonomy, in the ability to move freely without seeking approval. Watching control turn into fear revealed how unstable dominance truly is when it is built on suppression rather than respect. In the end, the power shift was not something I took from anyone. It was something they lost the moment they could no longer dictate my place. Fear filled the space where control once stood because there was nothing left to hold it up. And in that space, I stood steady, no longer shaped by their expectations, but guided by my own. Choosing distance was not an act of cruelty or coldness. It was an act of survival. It came after years of explaining myself, shrinking my needs, and accepting discomfort in the hope that understanding would eventually arrive. Distance was the moment I realized that constant access to me had been mistaken for entitlement, and my silence was interpreted as weakness rather than grace. Stepping back did not happen suddenly. It formed slowly, in the spaces where my words went unheard and my presence felt optional. Distance became the only language left when respect refused to show up. Boundaries followed naturally, not as walls built in anger, but as lines drawn with clarity. They were not punishments, nor were they demands for apology or change. They were quiet decisions about what I would no longer allow into my life. Boundaries meant no longer engaging in conversations that dismissed my feelings, no longer accepting guilt disguised as concern, and no longer explaining choices that did not require permission. Each boundary marked a place where I chose peace over proving myself. They were not dramatic declarations, but steady refusals to betray myself again. For a long time, I believed endurance was a form of love. I thought staying, tolerating, and forgiving endlessly would eventually earn me care in return. Choosing boundaries forced me to confront a painful truth. Love that requires self-erasure is not love. It is control. Respect does not grow from sacrifice that is demanded rather than offered. When I stopped bending, some people accused me of changing. What they really meant was that I was no longer convenient. That realization hurt, but it also freed me from chasing approval that was never meant to be given. Self-respect arrived quietly, almost unexpectedly. It showed up the first time I said no without explaining myself. It appeared when I chose not to respond to provocation, when I trusted my own memory instead of accepting rewritten versions of the past. Self-respect was learning that I did not need to be understood by everyone to be valid. It was recognizing that my worth was not measured by how much discomfort I could endure for others. Each choice to honor myself rebuilt something that had been worn down over time. Distance did not erase the history or the emotions tied to it. It did not mean I stopped caring or that the memories disappeared. It simply meant I stopped allowing those memories to dictate my present. Boundaries did not make relationships disappear. They revealed which ones were built on mutual respect and which ones survived only through access and compliance. Some connections faded naturally when they could no longer cross my limits. And while that loss was painful, it was also honest. Choosing distance, boundaries, and self-respect required letting go of the version of myself that believed love must be earned through suffering. It meant accepting that not everyone would agree with my choices, and that was no longer my responsibility. I learned that protecting my peace was not selfish, and prioritizing my well-being did not make me unkind. It made me whole. In the quiet that followed, I found something I had been missing for a long time. Alignment. My actions finally matched my values. I no longer felt the constant tension of performing or explaining or enduring. Distance gave me clarity. Boundaries gave me safety. Self-respect gave me back my voice. And in choosing all three, I chose a life where I no longer had to abandon myself to belong.